Imagine you are reading a novel. The plot is predictable, the characters are predictable, and honestly, you can almost hear the author saying, and they lived happily ever after. Now, what if I told you that one of the most influential voices in modern literature looked at this and said, nope, let's do something completely different. Forget neat plots, forget easy resolutions. She wanted to get into the messy, unpredictable, and fascinating world of the human mind. This radical shift in how we think about fiction is exactly what Virginia Woolf explores in her essay. This essay was first delivered as a lecture and then it was refined for publication. Basically, Woolf in this essay critiques the established conventions of the novel and how modern writers should engage with new forms of expression to reflect the complexity of the modern life. So, to understand modern fiction, we need to understand it in terms of the broader context of Virginia Woolf's work. Woolf was one of the leading figures of the modernist movement. The modernists believed that the traditional, linear, plot driven narratives that dominated novel writing before them, it wouldn't serve the purpose of the complexities of the modern existence. The modern world was a rapidly changing one. Think about the technological advances, the political tensions, and then that most horrifying event, the World War. And when we look at Virginia Woolf's own novels like Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, then you would understand that she is not just preaching something here in this essay, but she's also practicing that. And the fact that she is associated with something called stream of consciousness technique is something that she also talks about in this essay. So, by the end of today's class, we will understand the way she is criticizing the traditional conventions of storytelling and novel writing. And we will also explore her vision, her experimentations, and her ideas about innovative ways of writing novel and the way in which she looks at different kinds of contemporary writers. Now, we'll go to the text, and I'll try to read as much as possible from the main text, but I'll take up the most important portions. In the very beginning, she establishes the main purpose or target of her writing, and she talks about the modern practice of novel writing directly, and she says, modern practice of the art is somehow an improvement upon the old. So she is very clear that there was a set of practices which we can call conventions of novel writing before the modernists, and now she is going to talk about the practices and developments that are taking place in the modern times. And she is in the very beginning establishing that it's an improvement on the old system or the old tradition with their simple tools and primitive materials. So the novelists of the previous era, they worked with primitive materials. So obviously, because novel is a very new kind of genre and it emerged in around 18th century if you look at England. So obviously the resources that were available to her immediate predecessors, they were limited. So they were working with simple tools and primitive materials. And she says it might be said Fielding did well and Jane Austen even better, but compare their opportunities with ours. So she is from the very beginning establishing the fact that the modern writers have more resources available. That is because in all other genres, be it drama, be it poetry, the modern age saw a sea change. So obviously, the novel writers were also now having more opportunities than those which were available to their predecessors. And then opportunities of publication, opportunities of publicity, of readership, all these things were developing fast in the modern era. And then she says, it is doubtful whether in the course of the centuries, though we have learned much about making machines, we have learned anything about making literature. Now, she also understands that literature and technology, they are not similar ideas. It's like science develops upon itself. So it is very easy to say that people from the scientific communities or people who are engaged with technological advancement, they are working towards some progressive line, and you can kind of draw a very simple line going straight up when it comes to technological progress. But when it comes to literature, since it's first of all a very subjective thing, secondly, literature cannot be, its value cannot be calculated numerically, and its exact worth cannot be determined. So one cannot say with confidence that it has been a linear progress from the past age to the present when it comes to literature. We do not come to write better. All that we can be said to do is to keep moving. That is the only thing that is allowed or that is found in a writer of any age, is that they can make some development, but it cannot be concluded that the development is a positive one. But the only thing that a writer can do is to contribute in some new way. That is to be later judged whether it's a development or not. So that is what she is saying, that is what we have with us. Now a little in this direction, now in that, but with a circular tendency, should the whole course of the track be viewed from a sufficiently lofty pinnacle. So if somebody is standing on a pinnacle, like top position, and having a bird's eye view on how literature is developing, they will say there's a circular pattern. Means you cannot say the Greeks wrote worse than us because they were, ancients. We cannot say that. Neither can we say that we write worse than the people of the Renaissance because, well, we are modern. We cannot say that too. So it's all a matter of going round in circles, making some contribution when it comes to literature. Now that is when you can see from up there where you are not a writer. You are looking at the history of writing. But what if you yourself are a writer? That is the problem with Virginia Woolf herself. She is herself a novel writer. And she says, it need scarcely be said that we make no claim to stand even momentarily upon that vantage ground. So since she herself is a writer, she cannot say that I have an objective distance from literature so that I can judge it. So she is not an outsider looking at literature. She is an insider. So it's difficult for her to judge the merit of her own times or writers of her own times, because she is standing right in the middle of the action here. And she says, on the flat, in the crowd, half blind with dust, what dust, when a lot of writings are coming up and modern age saw a proliferation of publications. So it was like a lot of dust was there, and it was difficult to understand what is worthwhile and what is worthless. And in that scenario, what she's saying, we look back with envy to those happier warriors. Who are the happier warriors? The writers of the past ages. And why does she call them happy warriors? Because they faced comparatively far less chaos, and they had these fixed traditions to hold on to, and it was a comparatively easier path for them. So the older writers, the writers of the previous era, they had a more simple craft to make. But now, during the time of Virginia Woolf, the writing itself has become a complicated thing. So she is feeling envious of her predecessors, whose battle is won and whose achievements were so serene an air of accomplishment. Like, you have this godlike accomplishment when you think of Dickens, when you think of Hardy, you think of Jane Austen, like they have obtained a position of superior status, about which Virginia Woolf is writing, that we can scarcely refrain from whispering that the fight was not so fierce for them as for us. So she is saying that it's a more difficult job for us moderns than it was for the Victorian writers, for the Romantic writers, and the writers before them. And then she goes on to say, We only know that certain gratitudes and hostilities inspire us. Gratitudes because, see, if the novel as a genre had not developed at all, then what would the moderns develop on? So, obviously, there is gratitude for the predecessors that, okay, Fielding, Richardson, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, they initiated a process, started a path which was later built upon by the moderns. So there is gratitude, and at the same time, there is hostility. Why? Because the kind of conventions that these Victorians, these romantic writers, and the writers of the 18th century, they adopted, those conventions were not suitable or were not acceptable to the modern writers. And so they did not feel friendly towards those conventions, those writers. So there was both gratitude and hostility. That certain paths seemed to lead to fertile land, like some conventions were developed which the modern writers found to be suitable for continuation, and those were supposed to be, going towards a fertile land, others to the dust and the desert. So some conventions were continued and some conventions were done away with. So this is what we get. Our quarrel then is not with the classics. And if we speak of quarreling with Mr. Wells, now she is specifying three authors here. Mr. Wells means H.G. Wells, the writer of The Time Machine, Mr. Bennett, that is Arnold Bennett, and Mr. Galsworthy. It is partly that by the mere fact of their existence in the flesh, their work has a living, breathing, everyday imperfection. So, on one hand, she is saying that the writings of H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and Galsworthy, they are very, living, breathing thing. That means they are very popular and they have a life of their own. At the same time, they are not perfect. There is some imperfection in their writings. And then she mentions some other writers in the next line saying, but it is also true that while we thank them for 1,000 gifts, we reserve our unconditional gratitude. That means this is a greater gratitude that she speaks of when she talks about Mr. Hardy, Mr. Conrad, and in a much lesser degree for the Mr. Our Hudson of the Purple Land. So, now obviously, we can understand that Virginia Woolf has great admiration for Thomas Hardy and Joseph Conrad. In fact, Joseph Conrad is considered to be a modern writer himself, and if you have read The Heart of Darkness, you would understand why I'm saying this, because the way Conrad experiments with his narrative, he uses the techniques of interior monologue and frame narrative. So we cannot actually call him Victorian in any way, although his first novels were quite close to the last novels of Hardy. But still, I personally find the narrative approach quite modern in Conrad. So Virginia Woolf also has a lot of admiration for Conrad. But what is her problem with Galsworthy and H.G. Wells? Why is she calling them imperfect? Let's see. Mr. Wells, Mr. Bennett, and Mr. Galsworthy have excited so many hopes and disappointed them so persistently. So their writing has a lot of promise, but then they do not live up to that kind of expectation. That gratitude largely takes the form of thanking them for having shown us what they might have done but have not done. So they might have written a good thing, they had the potential, but they did not succeed. So she is clearly dismissing the style of Galsworthy, the style of H.G. Wells, and she says, what we certainly could not do, but as certainly perhaps do not wish to do. So she doesn't even want to follow the tradition, the footsteps of these three writers. So then she gives a very specific reason why she dismisses the writing style of H.G. Wells or Galsworthy. And she says, these three writers are materialists. Materialist means they are bothered about external realities. If you have read The Time Machine or any of the novels by Galsworthy or Arnold Bennett, you would realize that they focus a lot on describing the external situation, events, and they focus more on how the story progresses rather than focusing on the inner workings of the mind. So they are not much bothered about what's going on in the mind emotionally or how a character is affected, but they are rather more bothered with the externalities or the materials, you can say. So they are materialists. Not with the spirit, but with the body that they have disappointed us. So it was in the matter of spirits, that is spirituality, or you can say the emotional content in the works of these writers, it was missing, according to Virginia Woolf, and left us with the feeling that the sooner English fiction turns its back upon them, as politely as may be, and marches, if only into the desert, the better for its soul. So, if we break this sentence down, she's saying that the sooner we get rid of these kinds of writing, the better for us. Even if it means we are going straight into the desert, it doesn't matter, but this is not going to work for us. And then she specifically talks about some of the defects. In the case of Mr. Wells, that is the writer of The Time Machine, and she says the great clod of clay that has got itself mixed up with the purity of his inspiration. So Mr. Wells has this inspiration, he has good imagination, but then it is kind of weighed down by a clod of clay. And what is a clay? It's like a symbol of uninspiring, heavy material. So he kind of lacks purity or vision at the end of the day. But Mr. Bennet is perhaps the worst culprit of the three. She doesn't mention anything specifically against Galsworthy, but she clubs him along with these two. And it's understandable that Galsworthy, according to Virginia Woolf, has also focused a lot on the surface level understanding of human experience. So Woolf rejects him. And then when she comes to Bennet, she is extremely critical and she says, Mr. Bennet is perhaps the worst culprit of the three, in as much as he is by far the best workman. Now, workman means what? Somebody who is very good with language, with diction, with construction of sentences. So he knows about the technicalities of writing, but he is, very far away from that inspired figure of the visionary writer. All right. So it's like you have two kinds of people who design a certain thing. Maybe take, for example, you hire an interior designer who will set all your, stuff in neat boxes and square lighting. And then there is another person who will do something very revolutionary, inspiring, and would turn your house into a real home with a lot of warmth. Whereas the first designer creates an antiseptic space. It's like a sci-fi movie set. That is not home. So you understand the difference. So similarly, she is saying that having a good craftsmanship doesn't necessarily mean you are a good writer. So there she finds fault with Mr. Bennet. And she says, she uses a very beautiful metaphor here, almost a very similar metaphor, the one that I used about the interior designing stuff. And she says here, there is not so much as a draught. Draught means, a light breeze which blows in a room to make you feel fresh, to not let you suffocate. So in the writing of Bennet, the problem is he creates a room with very, very perfect windows which are shut so much that not even a small draught of wind is allowed to get in. So is that a perfect room or actually an imperfect room? Because you can't live there. And she says, there is not so much as a draught between the frames of the windows. This is the metaphoric space she is talking about. The story or the novel is like a house which is built by Arnold Bennett, where the windows are all shut beautifully, but no air can come in. So it is not livable at all, or a crack in the boards. And yet, if life should refuse to live there, that is a risk which the creator of The Old Wives' Tale, George Cannon, Edwin Playhanger, and hosts of other figures may well claim to have surmounted. And then she says how this difficulty can be or was surmounted, how life was gradually brought into this world of fiction. So, the problem is with the set of conventions that these writers followed. And what were those conventions? After a few lines, she writes, the writer seems constrained. So it's like the novelist is bound by his own rules so much that he cannot let his imagination go beyond it. And he feels constrained, not by his own free will, but by some powerful and unscrupulous tyrant. So these set of rules are compared to tyranny, where something is dominating the spirit of the writer, who has him in thrall. Thrall means in service, in slavery. So this novelist is just a slave of the conventions. He has this set of rules that these are the things that should be there in the novel, and he is just repeating those in his books. And Virginia Woolf is very much correct also, because when you look at the bulk of Victorian writings, you would see that at one point they were all turning out to be the same kind of stories, same kind of trope, same kind of movement, linear, and everything was so predictable. In the very beginning, you would understand who is the hero and how it's going to end. There was no complexity at all so far as those things are concerned. Yes, there were exceptions, but then mostly the huge bulk that was produced during the Victorian times, it all followed certain conventions. And those actually constrained the writer, bound his hands. And what were those conventions? To provide a plot, to provide comedy, tragedy, love interest, and an air of probability embalming the whole, so impeccable. So, you see, you can almost understand it if you think about the Bollywood movies, all right, or even the Hollywood movies, rom-coms, all have a distinct pattern. You need to have a fight scene, some comic elements, some tragic emotional scenes, and there has to be a love interest. So the same pattern is followed. And this pattern was very vicious because it did not allow the novelist to expand his imagination, to give free rein to his fancy. So here she is saying that these were the tyrannous rules imposed on the novelist, and this concept that they must run by probability. And this is all very Aristotelian too. Probability and necessity, that idea of a plot. And if you remember Aristotle's Poetics, although he was talking about drama there, probability, necessity, these things are the backbones of plots, and plot is the backbone of a dramatic genre. Although novels were not a part of literature back then, so he did not write on novels, but had novels been there during Aristotle's time, he would have given equal importance to plot in case of novels too, I guess. So this Aristotelian idea that there has to be these set of rules, that is very frustrating for Woolf. And she says, if all his figures were to come to life, they would find themselves dressed down to the last button of their coats in the fashion of the hour. So the conventions of the times were strictly followed by the novelists. The tyrant is obeyed. The novel is done to a turn, but sometimes, more and more often as time goes by, we suspect a momentary doubt, a spasm of rebellion. So there are moments, even in conventional writers of the Victorian times, where they try to break free. They try to create a difference. So she is calling this a spasm of rebellion as the pages fill themselves in the customary way. Is life like this? Must novels be like this? Why are we punishing ourselves? She is asking herself as a novelist, that why should I constrain myself so much that any kind of experimentation has to be an act of rebellion? Rebelling against whom? Who has imposed this on us? Why are we following these conventions blindly, which are so anti-life. If you look at the novels written in the Victorian times, you would see that although they reflect a lot of social elements and realities, there is something very artificial about them. The way in which the plots are made to end in some kind of a happy way, and a closure is provided. And she would later ask that there is no closure in life, so why should there be closure in fiction? And she is actually advocating for this idea that fiction should not be opposite of life, fiction should be life. All right. So usually we think that fact is the opposite of fiction and fact is reality, reality is life. She says no, fiction is a representation of life. And she's actually being Aristotelian because what is Aristotle saying actually? He's saying that literature, art is an imitation of an action, that is reality. Okay, so if you are truly imitating, you cannot be constraining yourself in certain conventional plotline or linear narrative strategies. Okay, and then such beautiful lines, they are worth even memorizing. Life is a luminous halo. Halo is what when you see these angels and divine figures, gods and goddesses, they have this circle behind their head. It's like a luminous, light filled round orb, which shows as if these figures are emitting light. So that is a halo. So life is a luminous halo. You cannot pinpoint the boundary of your life. It spreads beyond itself. Okay. And then she says it's a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us. What you are is not the entirety of your life. Suppose you're not just your body, you are beyond that. And then you're not just the experiences that you have, you're also part of the other people's experiences which flow into you and make you what you are. So your life is always connected with some other life. And in that connection, it expands beyond your own identity. So your life is not just your life, it's beyond you. That is understandable. We all understand that. She is saying exactly that thing, that life is a semi-transparent envelope. You cannot pinpoint the boundary. This is the end of my life's range. Beyond this, my life doesn't exist. If I ask you, where is your life? You would say, if you are from Kolkata, you would say, my life is in Kolkata. I would say, no, your life is in India. Whatever happens in India affects you. And then I would say, whatever happens to this world affects you. Whatever happens to this universe affects you. So, you're actually expanding into this infinite space. There is no limit to what can actually affect you. And therefore, you cannot put any boundary around you that this is the limit of my being affected. This is the limit of my life experiences. No, nobody can put that limitation on you. And she's saying, is it not the task of the novelist to convey this varying, this unknown and uncircumscribed spirit? Uncircumscribed means something which is not cut in any way, something which is not reduced in any way. And this is the work of the novelist, to give you this feeling that, say, what a character is feeling at the moment is affected by what another character is feeling, what another character is doing. And that interplay of emotion, that interplay of lives, that is something which a novelist should capture. If you have read any of Virginia Woolf's novel, you would really understand what she's trying to say here. Because in her novels, you will see that if she is at one moment talking about the inner workings of one character, the next moment she's looking at the same set of events from some other perspective, from some other character's point of view. And so one event becomes not just one event in one person's life, but one event shaping multiple lives and multiple lives fusing into each other. So there is no boundary line where one event is affecting one character and not affecting another. And then she goes on to say, this is the task of the novelist. The novelist should give you this feeling that life is beyond the boundary of one character's existence. It is, at any rate, in some such fashion as this that we seek to define the quality which distinguishes the work of several young writers. And now she writes about those writers, or specifically one writer who has really gained a lot of admiration, and his name is James Joyce, of course. She says, among whom Mr. James Joyce is the most notable from that of their predecessors. So, James Joyce, the writer of Ulysses, the writer of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. How is James Joyce different from his predecessors? And she writes, they attempt to come closer to life. So these kinds of writers like James Joyce, they are actually giving you the real picture of life, and they are not painting for you some artificial picture. And to preserve more sincerely and exactly what interests and moves them, even if to do so, they must discard most of the conventions which are commonly observed by the novelist. So usually, the novelists observe certain conventions which make the novels artificial. So in order to present life as it is, James Joyce and writers like him, they break those conventions. Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. The atoms which fall upon your mind means the thoughts which come to your mind. After you finish watching this video, just close your eyes for 5 minutes and don't try to think anything. You will see that even then you will have thoughts. That is the randomness of your mind. It cannot remain blank unless you are actively trying to remain blank, and even then you will have certain things filtering into your consciousness. So it's like bombarding your mind with thoughts. So if you are trying to be true to life, then how can you have a logically coherent, linear thing happening? Life is not that. Life is like in the morning you get up, suddenly you feel bad without any reason, and then suddenly you feel so happy just looking at some flowers, and those same flowers might make you feel depressed the next day. That is the illogicality of life, and that is reality of life. And that is what she talks about when she says about the atoms falling into our minds. Let us trace the pattern, that is the stream of consciousness. So if you follow, it's a very simple exercise I ask my students often, that you sit for 5 minutes and you think just nothing. And then let your mind do the thinking on its own. And then if you list down exactly what you thought, you would see that you were thinking random things, but they were connected by some kind of peculiar logic, which is only understandable to you. Something is giving rise to something is giving rise to something else. So it's in a stream that you're operating. So if you record that, you're actually recording reality, because that has really happened to you. It is not something you're imagining. This is what she's saying, that if we record that, let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance. To some other person, it might appear that, okay, if she is looking at a candle, why is she then suddenly, within seconds, thinking about her dog? Because she associates the two for some event in her past, which is there in her memory. So it is not incoherent in her mind. But to an outsider, there is no connection between a candle and a dog. But then if you are a novelist, what should you do? Should you not be loyal to the connection in the mind of the character? You should be. And that is what she is saying, that however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each sight or incident scores upon the consciousness, let us not take it for granted that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than in what is commonly thought small. So in small little things, life exists. Life is not just about the grand wedding you're planning, or the great exam that you're going to crack, or the huge job you're going to bag. Life is also a set of disappointments that you're going through. Life is also the moment when you forgot to switch off the fan while going out of your room. Life is all about all kinds of insignificant things, and when you count them, number of insignificant things are far more than significant things in your lives. So numerically also, that wins. So if you are to be a novelist, and a real novelist, like a novelist writing about reality, how can you ignore these small insubstantial things and just write about those grand weddings and great funerals? Anyone who has read The Portrait of the Artist as a young man, or what promises to be a far more interesting work, Ulysses, I am pretty sure you haven't read Ulysses, but maybe you plan to. But many of you have read, or you have read about this book, A Portrait of the Artist. And she says that in these books, she's saying, whatever the intention of the whole, there can be no question but that it is as of the utmost sincerity, and that the result, that is the book in front of you, Ulysses or The Portrait, difficult or unpleasant we may judge it, it is undeniably important. Now, fiction and novel, we consider them as synonymous, right? And the literal meaning of the word fiction is something which is not true. So we automatically take it for granted that fiction is about things which is not real. But this is the mindset which Virginia Woolf is attacking. She is saying that life is unpleasant, life is confusing. So obviously, reflection of life, that is the novel, has to be equally confusing. And it doesn't have to give you pleasure, because life doesn't give you pleasure. It gives you confusion and chaos. In contrast with those whom we have called materialists, remember Galsworthy and his team, Mr. Joyce is spiritual. So she is making a clear distinction here between people like Galsworthy and writers like Joyce. And she says Joyce is spiritual. He is concerned at all costs to reveal the flickerings of that innermost flame which flashes its messages through the brain. Flickering, flame, flashes. Beautiful alliterative line here. And what does it actually mean? That innermost flame that flashes messages through the brain. So that has to be written down in the novel, where you will not find any direct link between one event and another. The only link is that the two events are connected in the mind of the character. And that is why those two events are connected in the novel. Understood? And in order to preserve it, he disregards with complete courage whatever seems to him, that is, whatever seems to the novelist adventitious, whether it be probability or coherence or any other of these signposts. So signpost means all those things that a novelist has to consider when he writes a novel according to conventions. The signpost that, okay, are you doing things in a coherent manner? Is your character behaving like a normal person? Is the plot arranged in a linear way? That is coherence. So those are called signposts in a very derogatory way. And she says that these signposts are not considered by writers like Joyce, which for generations have served to support the imagination of a reader when called upon to imagine what he can neither touch or see. Now, when we readers, we read a book, we cannot touch or see actually what is there, the life that is given in the form of the book. We can only imagine. So, in our imagination, these are the signposts. We are expecting characters to behave in a certain way. We are expecting logical movement. We are expecting linear movement. Point of view of the narrator as fixed. All these things we take for granted as readers. So this is our attitude as a reader, which makes the novelist write the novels in a certain way. Joyce goes against this. And that's why most readers who are accustomed to novels by Dickens or Hardy or Austen, they feel like they are experiencing a very difficult set of writing when they look at Joyce's writing. And then she gives an example. The scene in the cemetery, for instance, with its brilliancy, its sordidity, its incoherence, its sudden lightning flashes of significance, does undoubtedly come so close to the quick of the mind that on a first reading at any rate, it is difficult not to acclaim a masterpiece. So the scene in this cemetery, which takes place in the novel Ulysses, it's written in a very brilliant way, but it's so messy, you can say, that there is hardly any coherence. You'll have difficulty in grasping as to who is actually thinking all these things and what is actually happening after one after another. So there is no arrangement of events. A lot of symbols are brought in. Okay, and entire thing is presented to us, this scene of the cemetery, in a very vivid way, but we cannot clasp it as an event. We cannot describe to somebody what the event is or what that incident is. And that is the difficulty with Joyce's novels. It's very difficult to summarize them. You would see a lot of summaries of A Portrait of the Artist, but none of the summaries, none of the synopses that are there all over the internet, no matter what kind of AI you are using, they can reach that core of the novel at all. Even we have tried making a podcast on A Portrait, and while doing the podcast, I was realizing that, okay, I'm giving you an idea of what was happening in Stephen's life, but it was so far from the flavor of the novel that I really felt bad at the end of it. Although I just hope that after hearing that podcast, some interest would grow in you so that you read the original novel, which is by far such a different experience from any kind of linear storytelling at all. Okay, so there's such a difference between the story of A Portrait and the novel A Portrait. I don't know, we are trying to do To the Lighthouse also. God help us. If we at all succeed in making a podcast on To the Lighthouse, we'll do that. But that would also be not at all anything close to the real novel that Virginia Woolf wrote. So that is what she's saying here, that it's very different from the normal, traditional approach of the novelist. And then she says, is it the method that inhibits the creative power? So while Joyce's method brings readers closer to real life, it also has its limitations. What limitations? First of all, the way in which he writes, Joyce, there is something very limiting about it also. Readers might feel they are stuck in somewhere in his very focused writing. They are thrust into the consciousness of a character and then they feel trapped. That kind of a feeling might be there in the reader. You might feel suffocated even at times. Because, as I was telling you, life doesn't give you comfort all the time. So why should novels give you comfort all the time? So that feeling of discomfort is there when you read Joyce, and she admits to that. Is it the method that inhibits the creative power? Is it due to the method that we feel neither jovial nor magnanimous, but centered in a self which, in spite of its tremor of susceptibility, never embraces or creates what is outside itself and beyond? So when we are reading A Portrait, for example, we are always inside the mind of Stephen, and it's like we're stuck in there. But then you see, in your life also, aren't we all stuck in within our own consciousness? So if we are in our real life working with this mechanism of being stuck in one identity, oneself, navigating everything around it, and if novels are representations of life, then novels will also give you that kind of a feeling that you're stuck inside a self. You're not free to move out. Okay. Does the emphasis laid, perhaps didactically, upon indecency contribute to the effect of something angular and isolated? Now, when it is just one kind of self you are put into, then what happens? That self is alienated. You'll see that Stephen is always isolated, alienated figure, and therefore you also feel that isolation and alienation. And with it comes the other aspect, that is, if you are so much deep inside the psychology of a character, you might discover things which you consider indecent or difficult subject matters. Think about the Oedipus complex perspective that we have in D.H. Lawrence's novels. So the deeper you are inside the psyche of a character, chances are that you discover things which you are not comfortable with as a reader. So that is also a problem for a reader in case of modern novels? Or is it merely that in any effort of such originality, it is much easier for contemporary, especially, to feel what it lacks than to name what it gives? So then she moves on to this method. Then, what is a superior method? What is an inferior method? Joyce's method also has its limitations, and the traditional methods are discarded right away in the very beginning itself. So, what is superior then? She says that no method is inherently superior. The right method is the one which is compatible with the thing that the writer wants to express. If he wants to express the complexity, then this is the only way he can. So she says, any method is right, every method is right that expresses what we wish to express, if we are writers, that brings us closer to the novelist's intention, if we are readers. So, if you are a writer, then what is the right method? Something which helps you express what you want to express. And if you are a reader, then what is the good method? Something where you can connect to the novelist's intention. You can understand what the novelist is trying to say. That means it is the right method. Okay? Did not the reading of Ulysses suggest how much of life is excluded or ignored? And did it not come with a shock to open Tristram Shandy or even Pendennis and be by them convinced that there are not only other aspects of life but more important ones into the bargain? So the point is, the thing that modern novels do, as I was telling you, they make you understand the significance of the insignificant things. Okay, and you would notice that in some of the movies, the director focuses on very insignificant things. Maybe some clothes are drying in the background, and maybe a litter box of the cat or some bird cage, which has absolutely no connection with the event in the movie or the main event in the movie, but somehow they add that symbolic significance layer. Because that is life. Life is not just the one significant thing that is happening to you right now, but so many other insignificant things. For instance, like the random notification that just distracted you while you were watching this video. Who knows, that notification might connect you to something very significant or completely insignificant, but it also happened. So insignificant things happen all the time. So we cannot exclude them from narrative. And that idea is given by Ulysses, because it's this fat a book and it's about one single day in the life of a character. Because if you really note down what happens to you, you are thinking, everything down, whatever is happening to you and whatever you're thinking in one single day, it will make this fat a book. Because that is life. One fat book per day. And she says, he has to have the courage to say that what interests him is no longer this, but that. So the real interesting thing is not just the important thing, but the other things that actually reveal what kind of person you are. Out of that alone must he construct his work. So this means conventional, important things that a narrator or a novelist usually picks up. And that means the uncharted territories of your mind. And out of that, you have to have your real materials. And she says, out of that alone must he construct his work. For the moderns, that, the point of interest, lies very likely in the dark places of psychology. This was also the time where psychoanalysis was coming up. Freud was like a bit senior to Virginia Woolf, of course, but then we have the ongoing debates on various psychoanalytic theories of Freud, and of course Joyce, even in Catherine Mansfield, and of course Virginia Woolf herself. So the dark places of psychology, dark doesn't necessarily mean negative or bad or sinful. Dark means unexplored, which we are not ready to shed light on yet. We are inhibiting ourselves. Heart of Bertha is that dark space which we don't actually get to see even properly. But at least an attempt is made to reach that part. Take, for example, the story Araby, again by Joyce. What is that child feeling? He's growing up, he's a teenager, and he thinks that his love is like a chalice. It's like such a pure thing, and he has a responsibility to not carry it through a throng of foes, everybody around him, the crowd around him. He has love for this lady, this girl, and he feels that this is the important thing of his life. And then at the end of the novel, he has this epiphany that there is nothing called significant thing in your life. You are insignificant. So how can your love be significant? So that kind of realization that life is not about that significant chalice, but it's about just about everything else that comes with it. The ash pit, the blind lane where you live, the dark room where you think, at the dark space of your life that is as significant as the spotlighted ones. The emphasis is upon something hitherto ignored. Till now, novelists were not paying attention to these unexplored things. No one but a modern, no one perhaps but a Russian. Now she takes a completely different set of writers. She talks about the Russians and she praises them that the Russian writers know how to bring out the beauty of the insignificant. And she says, no one perhaps but a Russian would have felt the interest of the situation with which Chekhov has into the short story which he calls Gusev. And then she talks about this short story by Chekhov. Some Russian soldiers lie ill on board a ship which is taking them back to Russia. So this is the plot line of that story. We are given a few scraps of their talk and some of their thoughts. Then one of them dies and is carried away. The talk goes on. See, somebody has died, but the talk goes on. So the death, which is supposed to be a significant thing, is shown in an insignificant light. It's like life itself. How is life in general? If somebody dies, does life stop? No. People go to his funeral, talk normally, and it just goes on. But we all think our lives are so important that our moment of death will be the moment. But it's so insignificant, and that insignificance is reflected here. And then she says, she goes on talking about the story. The talk goes on among the others for a time until Gusev himself dies. And looking, and how does Gusev look after he dies? Like a carrot or a radish. Nothing glorious, nothing glamorous, nothing to justify that this is the description of the central character's dead body. He's compared to a radish, carrot, and he's thrown overboard. The emphasis is laid upon such unexpected places that at first it seems as if there were no emphasis at all. I mean, where is the story? There is no story. Because if the main character's death is not given importance, then how can you call it a story? And why am I calling this character the main character? Because, well, the name of the story is after this character, Gusev. So obviously Gusev is supposed to be the main character, but his dead body is considered to be so insignificant. And then, as the eyes accustom themselves to twilight and discern the shapes of things in a room, we see how complete the story is, how profound, and how truly in obedience to his vision, Chekhov has chosen this, that, and the other, and placed them together to compose something new. And then we are usually used to novels where the central character is like the sun, glowing, okay? But here what Chekhov does, he doesn't turn his central character into that sun, into that central figure. And then therefore the whole story becomes like a twilight. There is no sun. It is all dimmed. And when your eyes are accustomed to that different kind of a story, then you realize that, okay, this is life. This is how life happens. So this is actually more real than the made-up artificial stories we have read so far. Since short stories being taught should be brief and conclusive, we all have this idea that, well, short stories should be short and they should give some kind of a message at the end. They should have a closure. Okay? Conclusive. Whether this, which is vague and inconclusive should be called a short story at all? So people might say that, will you call Chekhov's story a short story? Because he is not giving any conclusive thing at the end. The most elementary remarks upon modern English fiction can hardly avoid some mention of the Russian influence. So this is the Russian influence. Russian influence means giving this idea to British literature that you don't have to give conclusion. You can keep things open-ended. And then she says, after a few lines, in every great Russian writer, we seem to discern the features of a saint. What does a saint do? A saint knows the reality. If sympathy for the sufferings of others, love towards them, endeavor to reach some goal worthy of the most exacting demands of the spirit, constitutes saintliness. So what are the qualities of a saint? They will have sympathy for other people's sufferings, number one. Second, they will have love towards them. And third is they will try to reach some goal. What kind of goal? The goal which your spirit wants you to attain. All right. It is the saint in them which confounds us, which binds us with a feeling of our own irreligious triviality. She says that British writers are so trivial, so insignificant actually, that she feels almost ashamed when she compares like the English writers with the Russian writers. And she has this wonderful admiration for writers like Chekhov. Have you read any Russian novelists or have you read any stories by Chekhov? You must. They'll give you a different kind of a perspective on how life is captured on paper. And she says, and turns so many of our famous novels to tinsel and trickery. If you read those Russian novels, you would realize that the English novels, the famous ones, the Victorian ones, they are basically just works of tricksters. They are just sentences one after another. They are not life. There's something lacking in them. There's something artificial in them. They do not give you any conclusive ending. It is the sense that there is no answer. If be honestly examined, life presents question after question, which must be left to sound on and on after the story is over in hopeless interrogation. So life is a set of questions. Where will I go today? What will I do now? And significant questions like, whom should I love? And insignificant questions like, what should I cook today? And then once you answer something, it only raises more questions. So life is just a set of questions, one after another, that you ask yourself. And so she says, this is life, and it fills us with a deep, and finally it may, with a resentful despair. And we might feel frustrated if we have too many questions and no answers. They are right, perhaps. The Russians are right. Unquestionably, they see further than we do and without our gross impediments of vision. Impediments mean something which stops you. So she says that English writers have some obstacles in their vision. They have something stopping them from seeing things. Russians don't have this obstacle of vision. Writers, that is. But perhaps we see something that escapes them. But then there might be things that James Joyce can see and Chekhov cannot. So it's not like Virginia Woolf is totally disregarding English novelists. She's saying we do have hope. Or why should this voice of protest mix itself with our gloom? And that is why British people, British writers also have a tremendous capability, potential of breaking those conventions, rebelling against them. That's why these experimentations are coming up. And she definitely is very optimistic about the new kind of writings all around her. The voice of protest is the voice of another and an ancient civilization which seems to have bred in us the instinct to enjoy and fight rather than to suffer and understand. So there are these two ways of looking at literature. One that the Russians are giving, that is inconclusive, writing about real life in the real way. Okay, so that is the Russian way of life. But the British people, they are more into another ancient civilization, and she is referring to the Greek civilization. And what is the Greek concept of literature? Greek concept of literature is more attached with the idea of either enjoyment or entertainment or giving a message. So, filtering something, right? So, that is what we have in even Aristotle's idea. English fiction, from Sterne to Meredith, bears witness to our natural delight in humor and comedy. So, this is because drama as a genre emerged way before novels emerged. And in drama, we have these distinct categories, tragedies and comedies and stuff like that. So, comedies in general are very popular with British audience. So, naturally, even in novel, they want comic elements, they want humor. And not just that, they want beauty of earth, activities of the intellect, and splendor of the body. So, British readers, they want all these things in their novels. But any deductions that we may draw from the comparison of two fictions so immeasurably far apart, one belonging to the category of Russian fiction and another belonging to the category of traditional English fiction, which, kind of derives its philosophy from Greek tradition of entertainment. When you compare, then she says, immeasurably far apart, a futile, save indeed, as they flood us with a view of infinite possibilities of the art and remind us that there is no limit to the horizon. So, these two are such extremes that there is a huge possibility of so many experimentations in between. So, this is kind of also a very positive thing for her, that she has so many possibilities in front of her, or she as a novelist, or they as novelists, as modern novelists, they can experiment so much because the range is huge. You have on one extreme the Greek entertainment perspective, and on the other extreme extent, you have the Russian seriousness and inconclusiveness, no desire for entertainment kind of a perspective. And in between lies that huge space you can explore, you can experiment with. And she finally says, nothing, no method, no experiment, even of the wildest, is forbidden. She loves experimenting, and she sees this huge possibility, this difference between Russian and Greek perspective of literature. This gap is the zone where they can experiment and build their own genre. That is modern British fiction. The proper stuff of fiction does not exist. That is the beauty of it. There is no definition. So what she does in this essay is, instead of giving a definition of modern fiction, she is establishing that it is beyond definition. The moment she says that there is no definition possible, she is creating the possibility of multiple kinds of experiments. Everything is the proper stuff of fiction. Every feeling, every thought, every quality of brain and spirit is drawn upon. No perception comes amiss. And if we can imagine the art of fiction come alive and standing in our midst, she would undoubtedly bid us break her and bully her, as well as honor and love her. For so her youth is renewed and her sovereignty assured. So, novel as a genre demands a complete renovation, according to her. She says that we must bully her. How? Oh, you're a novel? You are only set of conventions. And then we will change those conventions, and then we will say, wow, you are a novel, you are such a great genre because you are so beyond conventions. So what Virginia Woolf is talking about here is not just defining modern fiction. She does not define it. She rather breaks all these ideas about narratology, about perspective, about storytelling, about characterization, all these fixed ideas. She breaks them to establish that there is no one definite way of writing novels. And this is the beauty of modern novel or modern fiction, that it defies all kind of definitions. And in the process, she glorifies, or rather, she expresses her admiration for, on one hand, James Joyce, and on the other hand, she talks about Chekhov. And she says that it is the unexplored side of human psychology. That is going to be the proper stuff of fiction. Although she doesn't say that fiction is going to have any proper stuff, we can easily understand that even then she has already established that psychological analysis is a very important aspect of modern fiction, according to Virginia Woolf. So we can say that this essay is kind of a manifesto which focuses on subjectivity and introspection, the fragmented nature of life, that it's not a linear, coherent set of events. Life is not that. So novel will also not be that. And therefore, she talks about or advocates a break from the constraints of plot, structure, characterization, and genre. So, the possible questions that you might consider if you have this text in your syllabus is that, say, what does Woolf mean by materialism and why does she reject it? So, materialism is like sticking to those conventions, emphasizing the most important aspects of a character's life, and the kind of storytelling that is found in case of Galsworthy and Arnold Bennett and H.G. Wells. So you have to talk about the first part of her essay, where she speaks about her predecessors. So those were the materialists. The next question is, how does Woolf envision the role of the novelist in capturing life? So role of the novelist in capturing life. How is she talking about that? And this is all about the main content of the essay. We have already discussed that. And then you can also be asked a question like, how is Woolf's conception of modern fiction different from traditional 19th century novels? So traditional novels versus Virginia Woolf's view. And if you have by any chance read any of Virginia Woolf's novels or her short stories, then you might have some examples you can talk about, and then that will enrich your answer. If you are thinking about some short stories by Virginia Woolf, Kew Gardens is a good short story. You can read that. You will get an idea of Virginia Woolf without having to read a whole novel. So you can read Kew Gardens if you want. It is pretty much very similar to the way she writes her big books. Okay, so read that short story if you can. Suppose you are asked to do a project on this modern fiction essay. You can take up Woolf's points and analyze it through her own works like Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse if you have read them, or you can write in general how some of the modern novels that you've read, maybe even Heart of Darkness or Sons and Lovers, even Toni Morrison's Beloved, White Sargasso Sea, those things are there in the CBCS syllabus also. In those novels, you will see how whatever Virginia Woolf is saying here is actually exemplified. So you can take up those examples to elucidate the points that Woolf is giving here. So you may list down in the comment section the names of the novels that you have read or you have come across which exhibit psychological realism as per Virginia Woolf. Let's see how long that list goes. So this is Virginia Woolf's modern fiction for you. I hope to see you all in a new video very soon. A new year is coming up. Let's face it all with new hope and renewed happiness. So till we meet again, this is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye-bye.